often half prejudiced. He was sort of skimmed prejudice. He had the right kind of prejudice in believing that the world was explicable, but his observations were those of a farmer in the farmyard. He saw that an ox was needed to pull the cart through mud, and he thus thought that rest was the natural state of motion. More generally, like all the ancient Greeks, he considered that casual inspection and thought alone could reveal the nature of the world. As a result, his prejudice in favor of rest being the natural state was bad prejudice. Tycho Brahe, Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton led the revolution that produced the first good prejudices of science, that the world is heliocentric, that the natural state of motion is to continue what it's currently doing until the force acts, and so on. But even their good prejudice, good because it was rooted in observation, was embedded in an underpinning bad prejudice, the supposition that the experimentally supported view that space and time are absolutes. But what a powerful temporary prejudice that was, for it enabled the entire edifice of classical mechanics to be constructed. So Newton's and his successors, Hamilton, Lagrange, and so on, their prejudices were even more erroneous, in fact, but enormously fruitfully so, for they also supposed, like the farmer in the farmyard, that position and momentum were simultaneously determinable. Thank goodness for that prejudice. It was a good prejudice for the time, as it was supported by the rather primitive experimental procedures then available and open to public scrutiny. But from that prejudice sprang a revolution, for experimental precision advanced, and more subtle experiments were done that revealed that all those prejudices were false. And as the door to the 20th century swung back, that whole edifice of prejudices of classical physics was overthrown. The prejudice that particles could be distinguished from waves went. The prejudice that there was such a concept as a trajectory of a particle, and it crumbled. The prospect of simultaneously specifying seemingly compatible properties disintegrated. The possibility of transferring arbitrary amounts of energy became sort of sand in our hands. And the prejudice in favor of absolute space and time was replaced by the relativity of space-time. And the destruction of prejudices, though, was like a forest fire that releases new growth. Despite the inclination of such great minds as Einstein's and Bohr's in quantum theory to accept the new order has become our new firmly established bridgehead of prejudices. Now, I've got a whole brain full of prejudices which my prejudice encourages me to consider at least temporarily good, and in some cases likely to be good for all time. First, there's what I shall call the foundational prejudice, that science represents a uniquely reliable way of illuminating the world and discovering its workings. Second, there is what I can call my operational prejudice, that the scientific method can be applied to illuminate every real question, and sort of incidentally can reveal the emptiness of vacuous questions. I consider that the scientific method can be applied fruitfully to the elucidation of its traditional magisterium, not just the mechanism of the world, but also everything to do with its origin, composition, and ultimate fate. I also consider that science can illuminate, largely through psychology and physiology, the inclination of some to favor religions, and of course, as we've been hearing, morality. It also has the power to identify vacuous musings, typical of theologies, such as the purpose of the universe and the nature of the afterlife. And thirdly, there's what I'm calling sort of a paradigmatic prejudice, so the currently favoured paradigms of explanation. When I wrote the book which Roger referred to, Galileo's Finger, of course, is, if you haven't seen it, that is Galileo's finger. It really is ironical that the only true relic in Italy is probably Galileo's finger. It's also not his index finger, but his middle finger, which sort of echoes down the centuries. So in that book, I had it in mind to share these pretentiously called paradigmatic prejudices. Didn't call it that. I called it the 10 Great Ideas of Science. But the ideas that I identified are among those that I would now regard as paradigmatic prejudices. I'll say what they are in a moment, but I'm prepared to stick my head over the turret of conventional safety and wave another flag of prejudice by identifying the ideas that I regard as likely to be eternally true. And I think it's safe, I don't really, but I'm saying that anyway, to assert that there are just 3 eternally true, universal, paradigmatic prejudices. One is that energy is conserved. In short, really, the conservation of energy underlies causality and hence the comprehensibility of the universe. The second universal is that although energy is conserved, its quality ceaselessly degrades. This is where we touch on my favorite law, Roger's favorite law, the second law of thermodynamics. It's my favorite law because it counts for everything. So for the philosophers, not the scientists, but the philosophers and lawyers in the audience, I'm going to give you a short course on the second law of thermodynamics, which says simply that things get worse. There's evidence for this, of course, in every daily newspaper. There is things getting worse. But really the delight of the second law, what it